You can save thousands of lives. You can stand on the stage of an international conference. But just one word, one single word can drag you back down to the deepest pit of humiliation. Amara Lewis knew that all too well. As a black heart surgeon, she had grown used to suspicious glances and half-joking, half-condescending remarks. But that day, in the first-class cabin of Aurora Air, under the stares of strangers, she heard a word she thought belonged only to the dusty pages of history: monkey. From the mouth of the one man with absolute power in the sky that day, the captain of the flight. In that moment, all the accolades, all the titles, all the sleepless nights spent saving lives, suddenly felt meaningless. She was no longer Dr. Lewis, the international keynote speaker. In his eyes, she was just a monkey. And that pain, though familiar, cut straight to her heart. But this time, the pain wouldn't be buried. It became fire, not just to strike back at an insult, but to start a fight to heal a system rotting from the inside out. And that was the moment the story flipped. The man sitting next to Amara that day, silent through every humiliating second, wasn't just her husband. He was Ethan Cole, the CEO and owner of Aurora Air. And that one seemingly meaningless word ignited an earthquake. Captain Dennis Hawk could never have imagined the destruction of his own career and the collapse of the power network that had protected him for years. This isn't just a story about one mid-air firing. This is a story about a cultural surgery where wounds aren't just stitched closed, but transformed into the driving force that makes an empire rise from ashes. If you believe justice isn't just punishment but rebirth, hit like, share, and subscribe to follow this journey. Because to understand what happens next, we need to go back to the moment it all began. Amara Lewis gently closed the last binder, letting it rest neatly on the fold-out table in front of her. Last night, she'd stayed up until 2 a.m., reviewing her presentation for the International Medical Innovation Conference in London. It would be her first time standing before an auditorium full of the greatest minds in her field, people who had once been her role models when she first dreamed of becoming a heart surgeon. At 38, after decades of grueling study and countless hours in operating rooms, Amara was at the peak of her career. But when she caught her reflection in the frosted panel across the VIP cabin, she didn't see the accomplished Dr. Lewis. She saw a black woman who still couldn't erase the memory of 1,000 quiet humiliations that had marked her path here. The VIP cabin of Aurora Air looked like something out of a magazine spread. Wide, cream leather seats stitched with meticulous precision. The faint scent of fine leather mingled with the crisp aroma of freshly poured Krug champagne. Warm lighting wrapped the space in an ambiance of curated tranquility. But Amara knew no luxury could mask the weight of a stare. She felt them quick glances that lingered just a little too long, scrutinizing, evaluating, the same way they had in her childhood, when she was the only black girl in an all-white suburban classroom. Ethan Cole, seated across from her, watched her over the small table. He set down his champagne flute, his gaze deeper than any words. "You okay?" he asked, voice low and steady. Ethan, who had resurrected Aurora Air from near bankruptcy into one of the most luxurious airlines in the world, was more than a CEO. He was her anchor when the world grew too heavy. Amara smiled, the kind of smile that spoke only between the two of them, and nodded. "I wanted this flight to be peaceful," Ethan said, with a half-playful tone that didn't quite reach his watchful eyes. Amara chuckled softly. She knew he always wanted to shield her from the noise, from the discomfort others would never understand. But deep inside, she sensed something different. The calm in this cabin felt like a mask, and masks, she knew, always fell eventually. She leaned back into her seat, listening to the hum of the jet engines like a distant lullaby. Behind her composed exterior, her heart beat faster not from stage fright, but from that familiar ache, the awareness that one small incident could strip her down to being an outsider again. She didn't yet know this flight would do exactly that, not only shattering the peace Ethan hoped for, but shaking their entire world. The soft cabin lights above Amara flickered annoyingly, the once soothing glow turning into a cheap parody of itself. Amara frowned and pressed the call button. Within seconds, a young Aurora flight attendant appeared, tense but professional. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lewis," she said softly. "The cabin control system is acting up. I'll try to reboot it." Amara offered her a calming smile. "It's fine. I just need steady light to review my notes. Do what you need to do." The attendant nodded and left, only to return moments later, visibly more uneasy. "Ma'am, it seems to be a hardware issue. We can either turn off the system completely or move you to another cabin, but at the moment, the cabin is full." "That's fine," Amara replied evenly. "Just turn it off." The attendant dipped her head in gratitude, but before she could act, another voice cut through the air. "What's all the fuss in here?" They both turned. Standing at the doorway was a man in a captain's uniform. Dennis Hawk, tall and wiry, his salt-and-pepper hair clipped short, his face etched with time but his eyes gleaming with something unsettling. He stepped inside with the air of a man used to absolute authority. "We're having a small lighting issue, Captain," the attendant said quickly, her tone placating. "My girls can't handle that on their own," Hawk replied, putting a pointed emphasis on "my girls," his tone a mix of condescension and mockery. The attendant flinched, lowering her gaze. Amara felt the insult ripple in his words not just at his crew, but at her. Hawk stepped closer. So near, Amara could smell the heavy cologne clinging to his uniform. He didn't ask for permission. He leaned over the control panel, acting as though she didn't exist. Amara didn't flinch. She kept her back straight, her voice calm but glacial. "I know how to operate a light switch, Captain." Hawk froze, then slowly turned his head toward her. A half-smile curled his lips, the kind that sized up prey that had dared to push back. And then he said it. "Sometimes these new setups can be tricky. Don't want the monkey getting scared by the flickering lights. Do we?" The word hit the cabin like a stone shattering glass. "Monkey?" The young attendant froze, her face draining of color. Amara felt an icy current crawl up her spine, all the trappings of luxury leather. Champagne, soft lighting evaporated in an instant, leaving only a brutal truth. In this man's eyes, she wasn't Dr. Amara Lewis, world-renowned surgeon. She was an animal. Amara's hands clenched, but her face stayed unreadable. A storm raged inside, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing it. In that moment, she knew the mask of civility on this flight had just been ripped away. No one spoke, no one even breathed too loudly. The young flight attendant remained frozen, lips parted as if to speak, but closing again. In the nearby cabins, muted conversations had gone silent. The insult hung there, heavy and suffocating, impossible to ignore. Amara sat tall, her hands resting on her lap. But inside, she felt dragged back to those suburban classrooms, the only black child among white peers, back to the games she wasn't invited to play, the whispers behind her back, the stares that made her feel like she didn't belong. She had thought those years were behind her, that her degrees, her thousands of saved lives, her accolades had freed her from that box society had once forced her into. But one word, one short, vile word had hurled her back to the bottom. "I'm a surgeon who saved thousands of lives," she thought bitterly, yet one word just reduced me to nothing. The feeling wasn't fear. It was humiliation, a deep, bone-deep humiliation that made every heartbeat heavy. Ethan hadn't stood up. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't done what others might do. He didn't need to. Through every second, Hawk had swaggered in and spat out that vile word. Ethan had remained silent, his eyes following every move. Now, he set his champagne glass down with deliberate care. The soft clink of crystal against wood rang out like a drum in the suffocating quiet. Amara turned her head slightly toward her husband. He was still seated, his face unreadable, but she saw it in his eyes, a storm gathering strength. To those who didn't know Ethan, he might look calm. But Amara knew when he was this silent. He was at his most dangerous. Dennis Hawk stepped back, as if finally realizing he'd crossed a line. But it was already too late. Ethan raised his gaze to meet Hawk's. His eyes were steel-cold, sharp, unblinking. No words. But the message was clear. You just touched the last line. The first-class cabin of Aurora Air remained silent. But Amara knew this quiet wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm. And when it broke, Dennis Hawk would have no idea how devastating its force would be. Ethan Cole rose to his feet. Not fast, not loud, but with a weight in every movement that seemed to make the entire first-class cabin pause. He didn't lunge. He didn't explode in rage as some might expect. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, and locked eyes on Captain Hawk with a gaze as cold as steel. This wasn't the stance of a passenger offended by an insult. It was the stance of a man who'd spent his life standing in front of people who thought they had power only to make them bow. "Captain Hawk," Ethan said, his voice low, each word deliberate and sharp enough to cut. "Repeat what you just said." The command landed like a gavel, not a request, but an order. But Hawk, a man used to decades of deference and applause in his cockpit, only scoffed. He didn't sense the deadly silence in the cabin, or maybe he did and still thought himself untouchable. "Oh, come on," Hawk replied with a mocking grin. "Don't blow this out of proportion. I was just joking. A little humor to lighten things up. My girls here know that." He gestured toward the flight attendants, trying to rope them into his defense. The young attendant kept her head down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. No one laughed. No one responded. The other passengers were beginning to realize they were witnessing something rare, a quiet storm about to rip through a space normally reserved for clinking glasses and polite small talk. A few discreetly unlocked their phones, pretending to scroll but quietly opening their cameras. They knew this was worth capturing. Ethan never broke eye contact. He leaned forward slightly, planting both hands on the back of the seat in front of him close enough to make Hawk feel the pressure. "A joke," Ethan repeated, voice dropping to an almost whisper, yet loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "You're saying calling a black woman a monkey is a joke." A flicker of discomfort crossed Hawk's face. He licked his lips but chose to double down. "Listen," he said, still trying to cling to authority. "I'm the captain. I can make this flight smooth or turn it into a nightmare. Choose your words carefully." Folding his arms, he added with a sneer, "Who exactly do you think you are on this flight to lecture me on how I talk?" The question hung in the air, dripping with contempt. And the moment it left Hawk's mouth, every passenger filming knew they'd just caught the turning point. Amara sat still, her eyes fixed on Ethan. She'd seen him like this before, quiet to the point of unnerving, and she knew the real storm was still in his hands. But when it came, no one would be able to stop it. Ethan straightened, no longer leaning on the seat. He stepped fully into the aisle, facing Dennis Hawk directly. His voice rang out clear, steady, slicing through the tension like a blade. "You want to know who I am on this flight?" He paused, long enough to draw every eye in the cabin to him. "I own this plane. The cabin erupted in a ripple of shock. A few passengers gasped. Some glanced at their phones, ensuring they caught this on camera. Hawk blinked, his composure cracking. Then he gave a dismissive chuckle. "You're joking," he said, though his tone had lost its edge. "You're telling me you own this airline. Please, I've had plenty of passengers who think they're somebody." Ethan didn't answer him. He turned to a nearby flight attendant. "Call the first officer here." One sentence, icy, final. Within minutes, the first officer arrived, a younger man with calm composure and a sharp gaze. He stood silently, awaiting instructions. Ethan turned back to Hawk. His words fell like hammer blows. "Dennis Hawk, as of this moment, I am relieving you of command. This flight is now under the authority of the first officer." The cabin exploded not with noise, but with energy. The attendants froze. The passengers held their breath. Someone from the back muttered, "Is this really happening?" Hawk's face flushed crimson. You can't do that mid-flight," he sputtered. "This is my cockpit. The law gives me absolute authority up here." He took a step forward, trying to reclaim his ground, but no one in that cabin still believed in his power. Ethan didn't flinch. "And the law," he said evenly, "also recognizes the authority of the airline's owner when there's a gross violation of safety and ethics. From this moment on, you are no longer in command." He turned to the first officer. "You will take this flight to its destination safely. I'll personally address the aviation board if needed." The first officer nodded without hesitation. "Understood, sir. I am assuming command." The words killed the last flicker of Hawk's defiance. Hawk opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around, searching for support, but saw only stares, some condemning, some recording, none on his side. The authority he'd once wielded so carelessly had been shattered in front of everyone. The cabin was silent. A new order had been established. Everyone understood Dennis Hawk no longer held power at 35,000 feet. Ethan delivered the final blow, his voice calm but commanding. "Flight attendants, escort Captain Hawk to the jump seat. He is not to re-enter the cockpit for the remainder of this flight." The young attendant hesitated for a split second. Then, catching Ethan's unyielding gaze, she nodded. "Yes, sir." She signaled to two colleagues. Hawk stood frozen. His face burned red, his jaw clenched, but his swagger was gone. Now, there was only a toxic mix of humiliation, anger, and fear. "You'll regret this," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. "Captain," the attendant said firmly, "this way, please." Hawk took a deep breath, spun on his heel, and began walking. But each step felt like a blade cutting through his pride. From the absolute power of a captain, he now trudged through first class like a prisoner on display. Passengers watched every move. Some raised their phones openly, recording. The faint clicks and vibrations of devices sounded like funeral bells for Hawk's career. He tried to hold his chin high, but he couldn't mask the stench of defeat clinging to every stride. Amara stayed seated, her gaze fixed on the window. She didn't watch him pass, didn't acknowledge him. Silence was her justice. Hawk disappeared toward the rear. The door to the jump seat section shut behind him. Ethan returned to his seat across from Amara. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They both understood real power doesn't come from stripes on your shoulder or titles you give yourself. It comes from staying in control when others lose everything. In the back, some passengers were already uploading their videos. Titles appeared on screens: "CEO fires captain mid-flight." By the time this plane crossed the Atlantic, the story of a firing at 35,000 feet would already be shaking the world below. The plane had barely touched down at Heathrow when another storm began forming this one. At ground level, on phones, laptops, and cameras across the globe, just hours earlier, videos of Ethan Cole standing toe-to-toe with Captain Dennis Hawk in Aurora Air's first-class cabin had begun to circulate. Now, they had gone viral. One shaky clip captured Ethan's calm but icy words, "You are hereby relieved of command." Another showed Dennis Hawk, red-faced and flustered, being escorted through the cabin by flight attendants like a disgraced officer. The headlines didn't need embellishment. CEO fires pilot for racism mid-flight. Hashtags like Aurora Air, racist pilot. Exposed shot to the top of global trending lists within hours. Each video was shared thousands of times, accompanied by outraged comments, words of support, and long-winded expert analyses. Social media had turned a private moment in first class into a public trial, with the entire world serving as judge and jury. It wasn't just online chatter. News outlets swarmed the story like sharks smelling blood. By the next morning, the names Ethan Cole and Amara Lewis dominated headlines. CEO teaches racist pilot a lesson. The moment Aurora Air redefined power at 35,000 feet. Morning talk shows brought in aviation ethics experts, social activists, even celebrities to debate the incident. Some hailed Ethan as a modern-day hero. Others criticized him for wielding unchecked power in the skies. But regardless of opinion, everyone agreed this was a story no one could ignore. Amara, sitting in her hotel room watching the footage replay on TV, felt a swirl of emotions. She was grateful to Ethan not just for standing up for her, but for doing it without hesitation, without needing anyone else's validation of what was right. But beneath that gratitude was a quiet, gnawing discomfort she couldn't easily name. She had never wanted to be a symbol. Yet now, to the public. Amara Lewis was no longer just a heart surgeon or an international keynote speaker. She had become a case study, a living example of racial discrimination in aviation, an unwilling icon of resistance. People spoke about her like she was an emblem, but they didn't know how it truly felt in that moment, the humiliation, the emptiness, the pain, too deep for words. Amara turned off the TV. She sat still in the armchair, gazing out the hotel window at the bustle of London below. Amid the noise, she craved a moment of quiet to remind herself she was still just herself, not a symbol, not a headline, not a hashtag. Ethan Cole was no longer just a name. In under 2 days, he had become the man of action, the CEO who dared. News outlets hailed him as a savior, ushering in a new era for aviation. Talk shows called him a model of leadership. Social media feeds flooded with tributes, plastering his image standing tall in first class over bold captions. One article even dubbed him the man who redefined power at 35,000 feet. But Ethan, the man the world now called a hero, didn't feel like one. In their suite overlooking the Thames, he sat in a plush chair, the golden light casting long shadows over his tired face. Amara entered, carrying a cup of tea, and set it gently on the table before him. "Do you know what they're calling you online?" she asked, her tone light but edged with wryness. "The man of action. Some people think you should write a book on leadership." Ethan chuckled softly, but it wasn't the sound of pride. He shook his head, his gaze distant. "I feel ashamed." "Amara." She frowned, ashamed. He nodded. "That man Dennis Hawk, he worked for me, in my company, and I had no idea someone like him was there. I built Aurora to be a symbol of civilized, safe, progressive air travel, but someone like that still existed here. That means I failed somewhere." Amara sat beside him, placing a hand over his. "Ethan, you can't take responsibility for every ugly thought and action of every employee. You did what any leader with a conscience would do. He looked at her, his eyes dark and steady. No. I don't want to be the kind of leader who just does the right thing after the fact. I want to know how someone like Hawk lasted this long at Aurora. How many more Hawks are working for us? How many passengers have been treated like you without anyone to stand up for them? The room fell silent. Outside, London glowed, its streets buzzing with life. Amara knew Ethan wasn't searching for comfort. He was making a vow. "So what do we do?" she asked quietly. Ethan tightened his grip on her hand, grounding himself in her presence. "We don't just fire one man. We dig out the roots. If Aurora has a cultural problem, we change it from the foundation." Amara nodded. In his eyes, she saw more than shame. She saw resolve to turn humiliation into fuel for something bigger. And she knew the real battle had only just begun. Ethan didn't waste time. When most companies face scandal, their leaders rush to manage PR, issue sanitized statements, and hope the news cycle moves on. But Ethan Cole wasn't like most leaders. He didn't want damage control. He wanted the truth, no matter how ugly. That night, in a conference room at the top of their hotel, Ethan met Clara Vance. Her name was infamous among corporations who had something to hide. A former investigative journalist in her 40s with piercing eyes and an unyielding voice, Clara had built a second career as a consultant to expose the rot inside perfect organizations. Clara walked in without pleasantries. She fixed Ethan with a sharp gaze. "If you just want to put out fires, I'm not your person. But if you want to find every infection festering inside this company, I will dissect Aurora until we see its skeleton. Are you ready for that?" Ethan didn't blink. "That's exactly what I want. No limits." Amara, seated across the table, watched silently. She knew instantly Clara wouldn't be easy to work with. But maybe that was precisely what Aurora needed, someone sharp enough to cut through every wall powerful people had built. By the next morning, Clara had begun. She didn't just interview employees across the hierarchy from pilots to ground crew, but combed through internal documents and emails. "If you want to know what a company really is," she told Ethan, "don't read the polished reports you get every quarter. Talk to the people at the bottom." Within days, Clara uncovered something troubling. On internal online forums for Aurora pilots, there was a user with the alias Icarus. This person not only shared open hostility toward Aurora's diversity policies, but also seemed to know in advance about the flight Ethan and Amara were on, posting inflammatory comments about teaching leadership a lesson. Clara documented every message, her expression hard as steel. She knew she'd stumbled onto something far darker than one arrogant captain. This wasn't just about an individual. It hinted at a coordinated network, with Hawk as nothing more than a pawn. She walked into Ethan's makeshift office and dropped the files on his desk. "I think I just found the real enemy," she said coolly. "They call him Icarus, and I'm going to find out who he is." Ethan stared at the files, then at Clara. He understood this was only the beginning, and what they uncovered next could shake Aurora to its core. Clara Vance was not the kind of person who could be overlooked. At 40, she had a compact frame, sharp angled features, and eyes like twin blades, ready to cut through any veneer in search of the truth. People used to call her the nightmare of corporate giants back in her days as an investigative journalist. She'd forced a chain of private hospitals to shut down over fraud, held a major pharmaceutical company accountable for hiding drug side effects, and built a reputation for burning down the facades others spent decades erecting. When Clara walked into a room, everyone instinctively knew nothing would stay hidden for long. That morning, the top-floor boardroom of Aurora Air's New York headquarters felt suffocating. Ethan Cole sat at the head of the table, Amara by his side, while senior executives lined up in rigid silence, trying and failing to look at ease. When the door opened and Clara walked in, they straightened their posture without thinking, as if bracing for impact. Without pleasantries, Clara set a leather bag on the table, pulled out a small recorder, and switched it on. The soft, ticking sound filled the room. "I'm not here to make your reports look good," she said, her voice low but cutting through the air like a scalpel. "I'm here to flip every brick over to see what Aurora really stands on." A few uneasy glances darted across the table. Clara's gaze locked on Ethan. "If all you want is a glossy report to calm the public, say it now. I'm not here to apply makeup to your problems. I'm here to cut this company open." Ethan leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "I didn't hire you to make anything look good. I hired you to tell me the truth, however ugly it is. Find every crack in this company's culture." Clara nodded once, as though sealing a pact. "Good," she said flatly. "Then I'll do my job." The very next day, Clara began her work. Not in the plush offices where the powerful sat, but in the places no one wanted to look: the baggage handlers' break rooms, the technicians' corridors, the cramped corners where flight attendants prepped for work. She interviewed everyone, from the crew hauling luggage on the tarmac in the blistering sun to the suit-clad executives hiding behind corporate jargon. "How valued do you feel by this company?" she asked a weary baggage handler, scribbling notes. To a group of flight attendants, she posed another question. "Have you ever witnessed disrespect toward colleagues or passengers that went unpunished?" And she didn't stop at conversations. Clara dug through every training module, every HR email, every document related to company culture. She cross-referenced what she read with the stories employees had told her. At the end of the day, while the building emptied out, Clara remained in the boardroom surrounded by stacks of reports, charts, and scribbled notes. To her, Aurora wasn't just an airline in crisis. It was a patient hiding a fatal illness in its chest, and she was ready for open-heart surgery. Clara Vance had always believed that the truth didn't live in polished corporate statements, but in the shadowed corners where no one was listening. And Aurora Air quickly proved her right. After 2 weeks holed up in crew lounges, lingering in cheap coffee shops where ground staff gathered, and combing through hundreds of anonymous employee feedback emails, Clara began to see what Ethan had feared: a crack that wasn't accidental. The first clues came in whispers. Young flight attendants shared stories of a clique of veteran pilots, men who'd been around since Aurora was just a mid-tier carrier, regularly mocking the company's diversity initiatives. "They say women pilots are only here because of quotas, not skill," a young female first officer said bitterly. "They call us names I can't even repeat." Clara didn't stop at hearsay. She requested access to Aurora's internal pilot forums, supposedly professional-only spaces that in reality had become breeding grounds for resentment. What she found was worse than she'd imagined: crudely edited images mocking Aurora's new board, offensive memes targeting Amara, and a steady stream of posts belittling women and minority pilots. But the real chill came from one user, Icarus. Unlike the childish trolls, Icarus wrote long, calculated posts, brimming with agitation. "They're turning our skies into a political playground. It's time to remind them who really owns these machines." Clara read every word, noting the repeated phrases: "fight for our profession," "protect the old values," "teach the leadership a lesson." This wasn't random venting. This was a rallying cry. And Dennis Hawk, the captain who humiliated Amara, was clearly not acting alone. Leaning back in her chair, Clara stared at the ceiling and took a deep breath. "This isn't spontaneous outrage," she wrote in her notebook. "This is an organized agenda." For the first time since taking on the case, Clara felt the familiar tension of her reporting days creeping back. She'd found the end of a thread, and pulling on it would unravel something far bigger than a group of disgruntled pilots, something that explained why Hawk felt emboldened to do what he did, and who may have been encouraging him. Clara closed her laptop, gathered her notes, and stood. She needed to see Ethan immediately, because for the first time, she believed this wasn't merely a culture problem. It was a conspiracy nurtured in the dark, and Icarus could be the puppet master behind it. Clara Vance had hunted powerful people before, but Icarus was different. This wasn't just an angry employee posting online. The precision, patience, and insider knowledge revealed in those posts screamed of someone entrenched deeply within Aurora. Clara knew she was up against a player with status, not just a nameless keyboard warrior. In her temporary office at Aurora HQ, Clara fired up her old investigative toolkit technical trackers, metadata analyzers, forensic programs she'd mastered in her journalism days. She started small timestamps, device types, network traces. Slowly, the digital mask began to slip. After hours of cross-referencing, one detail stood out: Icarus wasn't posting from home or company offices. Most posts came from a private, heavily secured Wi-Fi network inside an exclusive midtown cigar lounge, a place notorious for its discretion, where multi-million-dollar deals were struck in clouds of smoke under amber lights. Clara froze, recognizing the venue. Its doors opened only for a hand-picked list of members, a who's who of power across industries. She requested a list of members. When it arrived, she skimmed the names and stopped cold. Several familiar ones leapt out: members of Aurora's own board of directors, people who'd sat across from Ethan Cole in meetings, nodding along to his vision for the company, while possibly sneering behind his back. Clara closed the file and exhaled slowly, a cold smile curling at the edges of her lips. "You thought you were invisible." "Icarus," she muttered, "but you just showed me your tail." She grabbed her phone and typed a message to Ethan. "We need to talk. I know where Icarus is hiding." That night, Clara sat alone in her office, staring out over the glowing streets of Midtown. Instinct told her this wasn't just one person, it was a network. Icarus was a mask for something far larger. She had the thread in hand now, and once she pulled, the people hiding behind those plumes of cigar smoke wouldn't stay hidden for long. She lifted her cold coffee, drained it in one gulp, and set it down with a soft thud. The hunt had begun. Clara Vance had seen plenty of corporate masks in her investigative career, but as she followed Icarus's trail, every instinct told her this would lead to someone far more dangerous than a few disgruntled pilots. She started where the truth always leaves footprints money. If Icarus's words were incendiary, his actions left clear evidence. A veteran pilot like Dennis Hawk wouldn't dare publicly humiliate the CEO's wife in front of him unless he felt untouchable. And that kind of arrogance usually came with assurance buried in financial transactions. Clara obtained access to Hawk's corporate accounts, a process requiring multiple legal clearances, but Ethan had cleared the path. There, she found a large payment deposited into Hawk's account just weeks before the infamous flight. It wasn't salary, it wasn't a bonus. It came from a shell company with a name so bland most people would have ignored it, Northstone Consulting. Clara didn't ignore it. She traced the ownership through corporate filings. Within hours, the curtain lifted. The company belonged to a private fund under Richard Vail. She froze at the name. Richard Vail, board member of Aurora Air, the man who'd repeatedly undermined Ethan in board meetings, sneering that he was chasing diversity at the expense of profits. Vail, the old friend of Ethan's late father and the most vocal traditionalist left on the board. Clara dug deeper leaked emails, recorded calls, encrypted chat logs. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Icarus's biting, calculated rhetoric and insider references matched perfectly with Vail's communications. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them with a gaze as sharp as steel. This wasn't speculation. This was fact. Icarus wasn't some anonymous malcontent. Icarus was Richard Vale, a man sitting comfortably at Aurora's highest table while orchestrating a humiliation designed to break Ethan. It all made sense. Vale, who loathed Ethan's vision, had used Hawk as a pawn, goading him to turn Amara into a tool for public humiliation. This wasn't petty revenge. It was a calculated political strike. Clara snapped her laptop shut and gathered her files. She was no longer merely an investigator reporting to a CEO. She was preparing to unmask a serpent dressed in a tailored suit at Aurora's most powerful table. That evening, Richard Vale stood on stage like a seasoned statesman, smiling wide and gesturing with theatrical ease. The ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers and the rustle of evening gowns and bespoke suits, while a jazz trio played softly in the corner. It was a charity gala, one of those events where the wealthy purchase the illusion of virtue with oversized checks. Vale spoke about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the modern corporate environment, his voice rich, his arms open as if preaching to the faithful. "We cannot simply speak of diversity," he declared. "We must act to create equitable opportunities for all, regardless of race or gender." Polite applause followed. A few attendees nodded solemnly as if they just heard gospel. But at the back of the room, Clara Vance smirked not in admiration, but in contempt. Because just days ago, she'd tracked Richard to a very different room, a smoke-filled midtown cigar lounge. There, in the amber haze, she'd captured images of Richard Vale shaking hands with Dennis Hawk. No lofty speeches, no moral posturing, just two men whispering like co-conspirators. She hadn't caught every word, but the handshakes and knowing glances had told the whole story. A day later, Hawk boarded the flight that became a stage for Amara Lewis's humiliation. Clara now held the one thing Richard Vale couldn't spin away, proof that his diversity and inclusion crusade was a mask. Leaning against the wall, Clara discreetly raised her camera and snapped photo after photo of Vale basking in applause. These images would frame him perfectly, not as a corporate visionary, but as a two-faced schemer using moral language to cloak his treachery. That night, Clara brought the evidence to Ethan's office. He sat at his desk, the warm lamplight cutting sharp lines across his tired but focused face. Clara dropped the file onto the table, her voice like a blade. "We're not dealing with a power-drunk pilot. We're dealing with a snake in your boardroom." Ethan flipped through the photos, his expression hardening. In the silence, Amara leaned over his shoulder, scanning the images. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen men like Richard Vale before, but using her race as a political weapon to humiliate her husband that she would never forgive. The room was still. Ethan set down the last photo, his voice low and resolute. "Then we'll rip off his mask, in the one place he thinks he's untouchable." Ethan Cole had faced plenty of betrayal as Aurora's leader, but Richard Vale was different, not just because he was a board member, not just because he'd once been his father's friend, but because he'd turned Amara's pain into a political weapon to challenge Ethan's authority. This wasn't dissent. This was war. Later that night, in the quiet of his office, Ethan stared out at New York's skyline, the lights cold and distant as stars. Amara stood behind him, arms crossed. "What's your plan?" she asked. Ethan turned, his eyes unwavering. "We're going to expose him right in front of the entire board. No backroom whispers, no quiet threats. I want them to see who he really is." This wouldn't be a private confrontation. Ethan wanted the board, the same people who'd heard Richard sermonize about stability and traditional values, to watch his mask shatter. Clara prepared like a prosecutor assembling a case. Every piece fell into place: encrypted Icarus messages to Hawk, transaction records from Northstone Consulting, photos of Vale meeting Hawk in the cigar lounge, and even a statement from a lounge staffer who recalled Mr. Vale and the older pilot discussing an upcoming flight. One email burned into Ethan's mind. Clara had pulled it from Aurora's secured servers. Its subject line was short Flight 714. Its content even shorter, time to remind the kid CEO who really owns these skies. The kid CEO. Richard Vale had called him that before dismissing Ethan as nothing more than a boy inheriting his father's airline. But now Vale had weaponized that contempt. Amara read the email over Ethan's shoulder, then pressed her hand against the table. Then it's time to remind him who really does. Ethan nodded. An emergency board meeting was set for the following week, and when Richard Vale walked into that room, he wouldn't be the puppeteer anymore. He'd be the defendant. Inside Clara's file, every piece of evidence was a sharpened blade, ready to cut through Richard Vale's golden mask, and this time, there would be no shadow dark enough for him to hide. When Ethan Cole sent out the summons for an emergency board meeting, no one at Aurora dared decline. The invitation was brief, offering no explanation, just a directive for all members to be present on Monday morning. That very silence told them this would be no ordinary meeting. Richard Vale received the notice and laughed. In his mind, this was nothing more than a defensive move by a young CEO desperate to show he was still in control amid the media storm. Probably wants to apologize for overreacting on that plane, Richard quipped to his assistant, his tone half scornful, half smug. He dressed in a perfectly tailored light gray suit, wearing the confident smile of a man convinced the spotlight would remain his. Aurora Air's Midtown headquarters gleamed in the morning sun. On the top floor, the boardroom, a sleek fortress of glass and steel, glittered like a palace of power. The oval conference table, polished to a mirror-like sheen, stretched across the room, lined with leather chairs that signaled this wasn't just a place for meetings. It was a stage for billion-dollar decisions. Ethan was already seated at the head of the table, his back straight, fingers interlaced in front of him. He said nothing as Richard entered, just shot him a glance so cold it felt like it could cut. Amara sat quietly behind her husband. She didn't speak, but her presence made the air heavier. Richard glanced at her, ready with a polite greeting, but stopped when he met her eyes, calm yet piercing, as though she already knew everything he had done. One by one, the board members filed in. The atmosphere grew dense, like the hush before a storm. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others tried to mask their nerves with practiced composure. No one said much. They all felt the reckoning hanging in the air. Richard claimed a seat near Ethan, leaning back with his arms crossed, oozing confidence. "Let's get this over with," he said with a chuckle. "We're all busy people." Ethan didn't respond. His gaze didn't leave Richard, tightening the already suffocating silence. Clara Vance stood in a corner, silently placing a thick file on the table. None of the board members knew who she was, but her presence, a stranger in a supposedly closed-door meeting, only added to their unease. Amara remained still, but every tilt of her head, every blink of her eyes spoke volumes the performance was over. Richard hadn't realized yet that he wasn't the star of this stage, and the script he thought he'd written was about to become his unmasking. The room was so silent the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a drumbeat. Ethan tapped his finger lightly against the table, a conductor cueing the overture. He nodded at Clara. She stepped forward, sliding the thick file to the center of the table, her gaze sharp as a blade as she addressed the board. "I was asked to investigate what happened on Flight 714, she began, her voice steady and commanding. "But what I found goes far beyond a pilot who lost his temper. This was a calculated conspiracy." A murmur rippled down the table. Clara ignored it. She flipped open the file, producing evidence piece by piece with surgical precision. These are messages from the user Icarus on Aurora's internal pilot forum. These are financial transactions from Northstone Consulting, a shell company, transferring funds into Dennis Hawk's personal account weeks before the flight. She paused for effect, then tapped a remote. On the large screen behind Ethan appeared a photograph of Richard Vale in a cigar lounge, shaking hands with Hawk. "And this," Clara said, her tone like ice, "is photographic evidence of a meeting between Mr. Richard Vale and Captain Hawk, just days before the incident." The room erupted into chaos. Whispered accusations, gasps, and stifled exclamations bounced off the steel and glass walls. One board member turned to Richard, pale-faced. "Richard, what is this?" Ethan pressed a button, and the screen changed again, this time displaying vile, inflammatory messages blown up for all to see. The monkey and her CEO need a lesson. No one spoke. The words sliced through the room like a blade. Amara, still seated behind Ethan, didn't flinch, but her silence made the weight of those words all the heavier. "This is your voice, Mr. Vale," Clara continued, cross-referenced with financial records and online activity. "We've confirmed that Icarus is you." Richard Vale's face drained of color as he forced a strained, nervous smile. I can explain. This is a misunderstanding. Those messages. Enough." Ethan's voice cut through the room like thunder. He rose, locking eyes with Richard. "You turned Aurora into a prison of hate. You used my wife's skin color as a weapon for your petty vendettas." The room went dead quiet. Leather chairs that once felt like thrones now felt like shackles. Ethan turned to the rest of the board, his voice as cold as steel. "This is the truth, and now you will decide whether there's still room for this poison in Aurora." Richard Vale, who had strutted into the room like an untouchable king, was now nothing more than a cornered man staring at his own unmasked reflection. Ethan's chair scraped against the polished floor as he stood fully upright, placing both hands on the table. "I'll keep this brief," Ethan said, his voice low but echoing through the room. "Richard Vale is hereby removed from the Aurora Air Board, effective immediately. All evidence will be turned over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for criminal inquiry." The words slashed through the room. Some board members sat slack-jawed. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to meet Ethan's glare. None dared to defend Richard. Richard stiffened, his face cycling from red to ashen. "Ethan," he sputtered, forcing a warped grin. "We can handle this internally. No need for theatrics. I've dedicated my life to Aurora." "You dedicated it to yourself." Ethan cut him off, his tone glacial. "You thought you were protecting an airline's legacy, but all you did was turn Aurora into a graveyard for rotting prejudices and use my wife as a pawn in your cheap power games. That ends now." Richard lurched to his feet, hands trembling as if ready to protest, but froze when his eyes met Ethan's unwavering stare. At that moment, the doors opened. 2 security officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Vale," one said flatly, "you'll need to come with us." The room stayed deathly silent as Richard Vale was escorted out. Every step he took across the gleaming wood floor sounded like a death knell for the power he once wielded. No one touched him, no one spoke to him, but the looks that followed no longer respect, only disdain stripped him bare. From Aurora's highest seat of power, Richard walked toward the door, the exit of the defeated. Amara watched him go. She felt no triumph, no lingering anger, only a cold, hollow pity. A man who once had everything, now consumed by the very game he thought he controlled. When the door shut behind him, Ethan turned back to the board. "This meeting isn't over," he said, his eyes sweeping across their faces. "We're not just cutting out one snake. We're rebuilding the entire garden." No one spoke, but in that silence, every person in the room understood the old era of Aurora Air was dead, and it would never return. That night, the top floor of Aurora's headquarters no longer carried its usual cold, polished sheen. Only a soft, amber light spilled across the long desk, outlining the solitary figure of Ethan Cole. He stood before the glass wall, gazing at the New York night, the city lights stretching like a map of countless moving lives. But his mind felt heavy, weighed down by everything that had unfolded. Amara entered quietly, setting a steaming cup of tea on the desk. "You haven't eaten since this afternoon," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan gave a faint nod, his eyes still fixed on the distance. "I've done everything to pull Aurora back from the edge," Ethan began, his voice low and tired. "Rebuilt the brand, restructured operations, made it a symbol of luxury and safety. But all I did was rebuild the facade." He turned, his deep-set eyes meeting Amara's. "I didn't cut out the disease, and it's eaten so deep that someone like Richard Vale could sit at the highest table and laugh in our faces." Amara said nothing at first. She moved closer, leaning casually against the edge of the desk. "You're right," she replied, calm but sharp. "Aurora's like a patient who's had cosmetic surgery but still carries a failing heart. If this company is the patient, then I'll do the heart surgery, not just patch it, fix it." Ethan furrowed his brow. "You mean lead Aurora's Ethics and Culture Council," Amara said plainly, not leaving him room to guess. "An independent council with the authority to investigate, enforce, and report directly to the CEO. If we want this patient to live, we start at its heart, its culture." Ethan held her gaze, silent for a long moment. He knew she wasn't doing this to become a symbol. She had never wanted the spotlight her ordeal had brought her. But in her eyes now was the resolve of a surgeon who had once held beating hearts in her hands, a woman who knew exactly how critical it was to go straight to the wound. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked quietly, his tone heavy. "This will make you a target. It won't be easy." Amara's lips curved into a small smile. "You know, I've never chosen the easy road. And if we don't do this, Aurora will just be a beautifully dressed corpse. Someone has to take this on." Ethan stepped closer, placing his hand over hers. "Then you'll have full authority. This council will be yours. No interference." In that moment, they weren't just husband and wife. They weren't just CEO and doctor. They were two people who knew that if Aurora was to be saved, it couldn't just be repainted. It had to be dissected, confronted, and healed, starting from its diseased heart. Aurora Air had survived a media firestorm, but to truly live again, it needed major surgery, and Amara Lewis would be the one holding the scalpel. Amara wasted no time. Within a week of the board meeting, Aurora's new Ethics and Culture Council was officially established, with Amara at its helm, not as the CEO's wife, but as a surgeon of systems, armed with the authority to rebuild. She gave the initiative a name, the Phoenix Protocol, a ritual of rebirth, rising from ashes. "We're not just rewriting the rules," Amara said in her first meeting with Aurora's executives. "We're changing the way this company breathes, thinks, and reacts." The first step, 360-degree performance reviews. Every leader, from pilots to executives, would be evaluated not only by their superiors but by peers and subordinates. "Power must be accountable," Amara emphasized. "No one gets to hide behind stripes or titles." Next, blind recruitment, all identifying information, names, gender, race, background would be stripped from applications for key roles. "We're not choosing people because they look like someone at the dinner table," Amara said. "We're choosing them because they're the best." Then came bystander intervention training, teaching employees to recognize and confront discriminatory behavior instead of ignoring it. But this wasn't the typical dull slideshow training. Amara implemented immersive role-play sessions with real-life scenarios, forcing participants to experience and respond to the discomfort they once overlooked. One of these sessions became legend within Aurora. A group of veteran pilots was asked to play the role of female flight attendants dealing with passenger harassment. At first, they laughed, mocking the exercise. One even muttered, "This is pointless." But then a young female first officer stood up, unable to contain herself. "Pointless. That's what we live through every single day. You can laugh because you've never been on the receiving end." The room fell silent. Cheap humor turned into unease. In that moment, the invincible old guard had to see reality through the eyes of those they'd dismissed. It was both bitter and transformative, a lesson no lecture could teach. Amara, standing quietly at the back, watched it unfold. When the session ended, she said, "This isn't a workshop. This is heart surgery for our culture." In the weeks that followed, Aurora stopped being a company hiding behind a polished facade. It became a patient in recovery, painful but alive. Its blood slowly cleansed of old toxins. And under Amara's steady hands, its heart began beating to a new rhythm. 3 months later, Aurora Air was almost unrecognizable. The changes, once mocked as window dressing, had become undeniable metrics. At the quarterly review, the report landed on the board's table. Female pilots had increased by 15%, the highest in Aurora's history. The number of pilots and managers of color had risen significantly. Employee satisfaction surveys showed a sharp improvement, particularly among groups who once felt invisible. Ethan handed the report to Amara in her office. "Look at this," he said with a faint smile. "You're doing what everyone thought was impossible." Amara quietly scanned the figures. But to her, they weren't just numbers. Every percentage point represented a rewritten story, a female pilot once mocked by her peers now sitting in the captain's seat. A black maintenance worker promoted without whispers of diversity quota. She closed the report, leaned back, and let her thoughts settle. Each of these numbers, she thought, is a heart reconnected. Every policy is a stitch on an old wound. Since taking on this role, Amara had learned to live with resistance. Some still whispered she only had her power because she was Ethan's wife. Others dismissed her as a doctor playing politics. She didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing and why it mattered. In her meetings with employees, she saw the difference in their eyes. A senior flight attendant approached her to say, "Thank you for giving us a voice." A young first officer shared that she would never have applied if not for the blind hiring policy. Each story, for Amara, was another heartbeat in Aurora's revived chest. That afternoon, she walked the hallway lined with black and white photos of Aurora's history, from a family-owned regional airline to an international luxury brand, to a company rotting from unspoken prejudice and now, a patient healing from within. Amara stopped at an old photo of a classic Aurora jet and smiled faintly. The wounds wouldn't disappear in months, but looking at the numbers, the new faces, and the rewritten stories, she knew this heart was beating again, stronger than ever. 1 year after the event that shook Aurora, the skies were the same, but the company was not. What once seemed like reckless changes had become living proof of a rebirth. The Phoenix Protocol was no longer just a reform program. It had become the very soul of Aurora Air. The news came on a crisp autumn morning. Harvard Business School had officially invited Aurora to be a case study in its course on corporate cultural transformation. It wasn't just an honor, it was validation from one of the world's most prestigious academic institutions. At the press briefing, Ethan simply smiled and said, "Remember, we didn't do this to end up in textbooks. We did it for the people who live and work here." But when he faced Amara, he couldn't hide his pride. "Do you see this?" he said as they left the conference room. "You did what the board once thought was impossible." Amara shook her head gently. "We did. she corrected. No one does this alone. A week later, they boarded an anniversary flight, a trip with no meeting agendas, no endless calls, just a journey from New York to Rome to mark 1 year since Aurora began its rebirth. First class was quiet, but not with the tense silence of a year ago. It was peaceful, soft, as if even the walls themselves were breathing differently now. Amara settled into her seat, glancing through the crew list on the table. One name made her pause: Captain Ava Mitchell. The cabin door opened, and a young woman stepped in wearing a perfectly pressed captain's uniform. Her hair was neatly tied back, her confident smile tinged with warmth. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Cole," Ava said, her voice clear and steady. "I'll be piloting your flight today." Amara studied her face. She recognized it. A year ago, Ava had been a timid first officer who confessed in an anonymous session that she'd nearly quit, convinced she'd never be judged fairly. Now she stood before them as captain, a living testament to what the Phoenix Protocol had made possible. "It's good to see you again, Captain," Amara replied, a small, knowing smile curving her lips. Ethan, standing beside her, stayed silent, but his eyes gleamed with pride. In that moment, he understood something far deeper than any report or metric Aurora had truly changed. Ava gave a polite nod before stepping out. Amara watched her leave, her chest swelling with a feeling she couldn't quite name. This wasn't just a flight. It was proof that every wound, if faced and treated, could heal. Aurora was now flying with a new heart. The flight passed in serenity, real serenity. Not the brittle quiet that masked conflict a year ago, but the calm of a system that had found its rhythm again. Warm light filled the cabin. The leather seats cradled them in comfort. But what soothed Amara most wasn't luxury. It was knowing that every person working this flight was doing so in a fairer, healthier environment. Once they reached cruising altitude, the cabin door opened again. Captain Ava Mitchell walked in. Gone was the timid posture Amara remembered. Now, Ava stood tall, her gaze bright with the confidence of someone who knew her worth. She approached, stopping before Amara and Ethan, and dipped her head slightly. "I just wanted to say this," Ava began, her voice firm yet full of emotion. "Because of you, I stayed, and now I'm here commanding this plane." The words weren't dramatic, weren't flowery, but they hit Amara with the force of truth. Her throat tightened. She couldn't reply right away. In that moment, all the reports, the numbers, the grueling boardroom battles faded. What remained was this: a human being, a story, a life given the chance to keep flying. Ethan glanced at his wife, his small smile mirroring her emotion. This wasn't about image, nor a political victory. This was about people, about the Ava Mitchells of the world, who once believed they had no place here, now standing exactly where they belonged. Amara drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "No, Captain," she said softly, a warm smile blooming. "It's because of you. I just opened the door. You chose to walk through it." Ava's eyes shimmered. "But if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have known the door was there." She bowed slightly again before leaving, the cabin falling into a silence that was anything but empty. Amara watched her go, then turned back to the window. The sky stretched endlessly, sunlight gilding the clouds. She realized then that this was the true meaning of the Phoenix Protocol. It wasn't about being Harvard's case study. It wasn't about public approval. Its purpose was simpler and deeper: to help people like Ava stand up, believe in themselves, and do the work they were born to do. In that moment, Amara understood that her greatest achievement wasn't written in glossy reports. It lived in the people who had rediscovered their worth, and that was the greatest gift she'd ever received. She leaned back, her gaze fixed on the window. The plane glided through soft white clouds, the blue sky stretching like a quiet ocean. In that moment, she wasn't a heart surgeon or the head of a massive corporation's ethics council. She was just Amara Lewis, a woman on a plane that, 1 year ago, had been the scene of humiliation, now transformed into proof of rebirth. The old memories were still there, sharp as a scar, the hateful slur from a powerful pilot, the prying stares in first class, the silence of bystanders, but now, they no longer suffocated her. Like the incisions on a patient's chest, they had become marks of a successful surgery, painful, but necessary to save a life. Ethan sat beside her, reviewing documents on Aurora's expansion plans. But when he felt her gaze, he set them down. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Amara shook her head slightly, smiling faintly. "Prejudice doesn't die in a day," she said slowly, as if speaking more to herself than to him. "But every flight, every person their proof we can heal." Ethan stayed silent, simply taking her hand. Words weren't needed. They both knew that what they'd done hadn't just changed Aurora, it had changed them. She glanced back at Captain Ava Mitchell's name on the crew list, remembering her gratitude. She recalled the training sessions where veteran pilots had been forced to truly hear the colleagues they once dismissed. She remembered the reports where every number now represented a beating heart reclaiming its faith. Outside, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant gold and orange. The light reflected in Amara's eyes, making them glow as if lit from within. She drew a deep breath, feeling her own heartbeat sync with Aurora's steady, strong, and proud. Aurora Air had once been dragged down by the weight of its past. Now, it was flying not just on massive metal wings, but on faith and courage reborn. Amara whispered to herself, "Phoenix protocol from the ashes. Aurora rises." The plane tilted gently, soaring through a sea of clouds, and in that moment, Amara knew the work of healing would never truly be done. But as she gazed at the boundless sky, she felt the truth a once wounded heart was beating again, stronger than ever. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.